In January of 1950, a 28-year-old woman named Ruby Cardarelli was going through a rough period of her life. She had just ended her 9-year marriage and was left to raise 6 children on her own in a one-room basement apartment, surviving on a $99 monthly welfare check in Memphis, Tennessee. Eventually, Ruby realized she could no longer manage the children on her own. Desperate, she turned to the Tennessee Children's Home Society for help. This was a network of orphanages operating in Tennessee during the first half of the 20th century. Ruby asked the home to take her children temporarily, just for a few weeks, until she could get back on her feet. However, when she returned to reclaim her children after a short period, they were gone. All 6 had been sold to different buyers. Being poor, Ruby had no power to fight back. As she described herself, a hillbilly like her stood no chance against a well-established institution like the Tennessee Children's Home Society. Ruby Cardarelli was just one among many victims of the criminal web run by Miss Georgia Tann, the director of the Memphis branch of the society. Ruby was actually one of the more fortunate ones. Over the course of almost 3 decades, Georgia Tann, using her position as director, built one of the most intricate child trafficking networks in US history. Her goal was to obtain children by any means necessary, including kidnapping, and sell them for enormous profits to the highest bidders among the wealthy elites, primarily in California and New York. A lot of these children were also severely abused, and some of them even killed. This is the story of Georgia Tann's child trafficking empire. Beulah George Tann, better known as Georgia Tann, was born on July 18, 1891 in Philadelphia, Mississippi. Not to be confused with Philly, Pennsylvania. Philadelphia, Mississippi is a small town in the deep south of the United States. Although Georgia spent her childhood in an even smaller town, Hickory, Mississippi. Her father, George Clark Tann, was a long-serving district court judge in Mississippi. He was considered one of the most educated men in town, but was also described as domineering, arrogant, and a womanizer, cheating on his wife in broad daylight. Professionally, he gained recognition for introducing probation work in Mississippi, and his legal career was also closely tied to working with orphans. Georgia Tann's mother, Beulah Yates Tann, was a school teacher, which was uncommon at the time since many women in the early 1900s didn't work outside the home. Georgia also had a younger brother, Robert Roy Tann, who later became an editor of the Newton County Recorder newspaper. By all accounts, Georgia Tann grew up in a loving, upper-class family. The Tanns were actually one of the first families in Mississippi. Their home was reportedly a favorite gathering place for neighborhood children. From the moment she could walk, Georgia's father was determined to mold her into a musician, enrolling her in rigorous piano lessons that continued into her adulthood. Georgia would sit for hours at the piano, laboriously picking out scales with her small fingers. She later remarked, "I was glued to a piano stool at 5, and I didn't get away from it until I was grown." However, it became clear from her later actions and behavior that she did not share her father's dream of her becoming the next Mozart. Instead, she developed a keen interest in law. As the daughter of a judge, Georgia found herself fascinated by her father's profession. While other girls her age were attending dances and learning to waltz or do the two-step, Georgia discovered a passion for law inside her father's courtroom. She loved sneaking in to observe court proceedings and once admitted, "All the time my father had glued me to the piano stool, I wanted to become a lawyer." It was during this time that Georgia first developed an interest in homeless and unwanted children, as many of her father's court cases involved such issues. In fact, due to his work with orphan children, Judge Tann would often bring these children to their family home, likely so they could stay there before a decision was made about their future. He would often say to his family in frustration, "I wish I had a doctor, a school teacher, and a good far-seeing minister to sit as a committee and help me decide what should be done with these children." All of these experiences made a deep impression on Georgia, shaping her sense of purpose in life. She wanted to become a lawyer. However, things were much more difficult for women at that time. Georgia reflected, "I studied law with my father and passed the state bar examination in Mississippi, but he never allowed me to practice law because it wasn't customary for women then, and I was the only girl in the family." Instead, Georgia Tann graduated from Martha Washington College in Virginia with a degree in music in 1913. However, by that time, she'd grown to despise playing the piano and resented not being able to follow her own dream of becoming a lawyer, instead fulfilling her father's wish for her to be a musician. However, as often happens in life, Georgia found her calling in the next best thing to law: social work, a field she had also studied through courses at Columbia University. Although not a lawyer, working as a social worker allowed Georgia to continue her involvement with orphan children, a deep interest she had developed through her father's work. To an outside observer, this interest might have seemed good-hearted and noble, but for Georgia Tann, it held a darker meaning. Georgia Tann was initially employed as the receiving director at the Mississippi Children's Home Finding Society. Much like today, Mississippi was one of the poorest regions in the United States. Working in such an environment, Tann began to develop theories on class differences. She saw an opportunity in the stark contrast between impoverished families and the wealthy elite. A seed took root in her mind while working in Mississippi, that poverty-stricken mothers and families were nothing more than breeders and cows, as she referred them as, incapable of proper parenting, while the wealthy elite were the ones who deserved and were capable of raising children, even if those children had to be forcibly taken from their biological parents. Anyway, her first position at the Mississippi Children's Home Finding Society ended rather quickly. She was in fact terminated due to her questionable child placement methods, which likely reflected her already well-formed views on poor families raising children. Afterwards, her father used his connections to get her a job at a similar institution in Texas, where she worked briefly before moving to Memphis, Tennessee, where she would begin building her criminal network. However, before we discuss her operations in Memphis, there are two more important things to mention about her time in Mississippi. During that period, she worked alongside a childhood friend of hers named Ann Atwood. According to all available accounts and opinions, Georgia Tann and Ann Atwood developed a romantic relationship while working in Mississippi, a relationship they continued when they moved together to Memphis. They kept their relationship private, or at least tried to present it as a simple friendship and cohabitation, as it was the 1920s, a time when such relationships were socially stigmatized. Ann Atwood was also 8 years younger than Georgia Tann. To be precise, actually, she was Ann Atwood Hollingsworth, because shortly before their move to Memphis, she gave birth to a boy named Jack, and she took Jack's father's last name, Hollingsworth, to give the impression that she was a widow rather than a woman who had a child out of wedlock. The second important detail about Georgia Tann's time in Mississippi is that in 1922, she adopted a daughter of her own named June. For those of you who might later try to see this adoption as a positive aspect of Georgia Tann's character, I would argue that this adoption was opportunistic as well. It was likely done to enhance her public image as a respectable, loving woman and an upstanding member of society, rather than something done out of genuine desire to provide a good life for an orphan child. Why do I say this? Well, because June's daughter, so Georgia Tann's granddaughter, later stated in an interview that Georgia Tann was a, quote, cold fish, end of quote, and gave June material things but little else. Everything Georgia Tann did seemed motivated by self-interest and viewed through the lens of personal gain. In any case, she moved to Tennessee with her partner Ann Atwood, Ann's son Jack, and her adopted daughter June. Georgia Tann was hired as the executive secretary of the Tennessee Children's Home Society's Memphis branch in 1924. By all accounts, her trafficking operation began almost immediately after she took her position. She likely refined the ideas she had developed while working in Mississippi and Texas, and swiftly implemented them upon arriving in Memphis, Tennessee. The Tennessee Children's Home Society was a network of orphanages operating in several cities across Tennessee during the first half of the 20th century, including Memphis, Jackson, Knoxville, and Chattanooga. Although there was a board of directors above Georgia Tann, she used her intelligence and aggressive manipulative tactics to eventually take control of the entire organization. She began her trafficking operation in 1924. At the time, adoptions were not very common and were severely underregulated, which Georgia Tann exploited to her advantage. She used various methods to prepare children. Initially, she started small, but as her network, power, and experience grew, she began implementing more aggressive tactics. First and foremost, it's worth noting that almost all of the children taken and sold by Georgia Tann came from poor families. One of her early and less sinister tactics, if it can be even called that, involved pressuring poverty-stricken parents into selling or even giving up their children. She would reportedly have mothers sign release forms for their newborn babies while they were still under heavy sedation. Tann preferred to receive the children early, saying she wanted to have them before they developed thrush or some other infection in the hospital. She also arranged to take children born to inmates at Tennessee's mental institutions and wards of the state through her connections.
There was an inmate up at the Western State Hospital for the Insane that had babies just every year. No one knew who the father was or the fathers, whether they were other inmates or whether they were attendants. But she placed them out as being healthy children.
These methods, along with selling already orphaned children, sustained her operation in its early stages. However, as the years passed and her business grew, Tann resorted to more sinister methods of obtaining children. These included legal actions against poor parents, which she carried out with the help of her friend, juvenile court judge Camille Kelly. Judge Kelly was allegedly one of the key figures on Georgia Tann's payroll. She used her authority as a judge to legitimize Tann's underworld crimes. Tann would identify children coming from poor homes unable to provide adequate care, and Judge Kelly would push these cases through her dockets. Kelly also severed custody rights from divorced mothers, handing their children over to Tann, who then arranged for their adoption into quote-unquote better homes. Eventually, as demand for children grew, Georgia Tann turned to outright kidnappings. One common method, as seen in the case of Ruby Cardarelli, involved parents temporarily placing children in her orphanage because the families were facing hardship. However, instead of reuniting with their children after a temporary period passed, Georgia Tann would sell them. She was also documented taking babies born to unwed mothers, falsely claiming they needed medical care. When the mothers wanted to see their children, Tann and her accomplices would tell them that the babies had died, when in fact they had been placed in foster homes or sold. One chilling account was described in 1993 in the Oregonian newspaper, when a man named Billy Hales shared his story of being abducted by Georgia Tann. It was late May or early June 1943. I was in a daycare center. My mother was a single parent and she was at work. Two women posing as social workers came and said they had papers to pick me up. They took me away. He continued explaining that these women also snatched a younger girl that same day. Billy and the girl were driven across the state of Tennessee to Georgia Tann's mansion. The girl started crying, and they slapped her hard, making her nose bleed. Then they got angry because there was blood on her dress, so they ripped her clothes off and left her in a ditch in the pouring rain until she stopped crying. As for me, I sat quietly in the back seat, too scared to say anything. I was so quiet that I remember wetting my pants out of fear. Billy Hales was 6 years old at the time, and the two women were Georgia Tann's accomplices. When he finally arrived at Tann's mansion, he met the Ice Queen herself and endured severe abuse before being sold to a wealthy family. These were just some of the documented ways Georgia Tann prepared children. So, how much did Georgia Tann sell these children for, and to whom? Well, to start off, legal adoptions in Tennessee at the time cost a symbolic $7, which covered a few court fees. Georgia Tann, of course, saw this as a missed opportunity and turned it into a highly lucrative business. Over the span of almost 3 decades, she sold thousands of children, with as many as 80% going to wealthy residents of California and New York. This situation was ideal for Tann for several reasons. A. Both California and New York had extremely wealthy individuals with an insatiable demand for children. B. These states were far from Tennessee and beyond the immediate reach of local law enforcement. And C. Not only were her clients rich, but many of them were also famous and influential, which allowed Tann to build a powerful trafficking network. A lot of the babies were actually sold to Hollywood. Some of the notable, known figures who used Tann's services included actress Joanne Crawford, June Allison and Dick Powell, and New York governor and financier Herbert Lehman. On a side note, professional wrestler Ric Flair was one of the children sold by Georgia Tann. Interestingly, Tann sometimes blatantly advertised babies for sale in local newspapers. Here are a few examples of these ads. I mean, look at this. Joe wants a home. And this, for someone stalking, Thelma, aged 4, and her 14-year-old sister are two of 1936's Christmas babies for sale. As I mentioned, the legal cost for adopting a baby was a symbolic $7, but Georgia Tann's underworld network charged anywhere from $700 to $5,000, amounts that would be equivalent to tens of thousands of dollars today. Alma Walton and Regina Warner were two of Tann's associates who transported babies regularly, making trips every 3 weeks with 4 to 6 children. Walton traveled to California and Warner to New York. They reportedly chose pre-dawn flights to avoid drawing attention from curious Memphis residents. Before the children were sent off, Georgia Tann destroyed their original records and falsified new ones, creating a new identity for each child and concealing how they came into her custody. One of the more disturbing aspects of her operation was that Tann conducted minimal background checks, or none at all, on the people to whom she sold these children to. As a result, many were placed in homes where they were basically exploited as slaves on farms, while others ended up in more abusive environments. The money from this operation was funneled into a secret bank account under a false corporation name. Allegedly, Tann kept 80 to 90% of the profits. Given the size and efficiency of her long-standing, well-oiled operation, the fact that Georgia Tann kept such a large share suggests that the network was a massive cash generator. However, to me, the most disturbing part of this whole ordeal is what happened to these children from the time they were kidnapped to the moment they were sold. The true trauma and horror happened while they were in the care of Georgia Tann. They were neglected, physically and abused, and some even murdered. The children were quote-unquote taken care of by individuals who, although dressed in all white like professional staff, were mostly untrained substance abusers. The lack of housing facilities resulted in children being placed wherever possible. They also had no patience for the younglings, so they frequently beat them up and sedated them to shut them up. To get back to the aforementioned account of Billy Hales, He remembered, on the first day that I met Georgia Tann, I was left in a room alone. I reached over to see this pretty lamp and the thing fell over. Georgia Tann came running in and hit me many times. I was bleeding from a cut and my nose and had bruises all over me. Then she threw me across the room. The really unlucky ones were allegedly used, or rather, only the few lucky ones weren't. Again, then 6-year-old Billy Hales was one of the unlucky ones. He said he was used over 200 times before he was sold for $750. Allegedly, Georgia Tann herself used the young female kids that she preferred, while the male babies were molested by a male caretaker who took them into the woods. Georgia Tann also routinely ignored doctors' recommendations for sick children, denying them care or medicine, which often resulted in preventable deaths from illnesses such as diarrhea. Those who were considered too difficult to sell were left to die of malnutrition, and some were even killed for reasons unknown. Some of her victims are buried in Elmwood Cemetery in Memphis, Tennessee, where a memorial now stands in their honor. The exact number of children who died due to her mistreatment remains unknown, but estimates suggest around 500 deaths. The severity of her crimes is evident in the fact that Shelby County in Memphis had the highest infant mortality rate in the country at the time, largely due to Georgia Tann's criminal actions. Because of that, many people dubbed her a serial killer. Georgia Tann criminal network operated for almost 3 decades like a well-oiled machine. She was without a doubt a smart woman who understood from the start the importance of having friends in high places. One of the key figures in her web of crime was the aforementioned juvenile court judge Camille Kelly. Kelly played a crucial role in the operational side of the network, as her court decisions provided legitimacy to Tann's illegal activities. However, one figure stands above Judge Kelly in this entire scheme, and that is Edward Hall Crump, better known as Boss Crump, a former mayor and U.S. House of Representatives member who has a leading role in Tennessee politics for decades. Georgia Tann allegedly had extensive connections with Boss Crump. He was known to accept bribes from illegal establishments, which is a fact Tann used to her advantage. With such powerful friends and influence, Georgia Tann was widely respected in the community. She crafted an image of herself as not only renowned, but also knowledgeable in her field. Even the former First Lady of the United States, Eleanor Roosevelt, considered her an expert in adoption, a title that, to Tann's credit, she did earn, though not in the way Miss Roosevelt believed. Georgia Tann often appeared in newspapers, criticizing other institutions for child and abuse, which only highlights the hypocrisy of her character. It's astonishing, actually, how the media praised her as an angel and a savior of children, while in reality, she was a demon to them. Even more astonishing is that, due to her respected status in the community, Georgia Tann helped shape Tennessee's adoption laws. Given the nature of her business, it was critical for Tann that adoption records remain confidential and sealed. It's also important to note that her public image wasn't maintained solely by her seemingly selfless work and supposed deep love for children, but also by fear. Tann employed many of the same intimidation tactics used by her protector, Boss Crump. Anyone who dared to criticize her would face threats. Actually, one of her favorite warnings was, "If you don't stay quiet, I'll report you to Mr. Crump." However, Georgia Tann did have critics. Over the years, more and more individuals, such as doctors for instance, began noticing anomalies surrounding Tann and the Tennessee Children's Home Society. Yet all attempts to investigate her activities were thwarted due to her strong connections with the elite. This, however, changed in 1948 when Crump's political rival, Gordon Browning, won the gubernatorial election and became Tennessee's governor. While Crump remained highly influential in Tennessee, the newly elected Governor Browning sought every opportunity to weaken Crump's political machine. rumors and allegations about Georgia Tann's illegal activities and her ties to Crump finally had political backing under Gordon Browning, who, in 1950, launched an investigation into Tann's alleged ficking network. He appointed Memphis attorney Robert Taylor to lead the case. Everything was in place to arrest and prosecute Georgia Tann when on September 15, 1950, just 3 days before charges were to be filed, she died of uterine cancer. Though she had been battling with the illness for a few years, her death came as a shock to the prosecutors. Well, actually, her death not only marked the end of the trafficking scheme, but also the end of any serious efforts to hold others accountable. It's crystal clear that Georgia Tann had many accomplices in her operation, yet after her death, minimal efforts were made to punish those involved. Judge Camille Kelly, facing severe allegations, resigned from her 30-year-old tenure as a judge, but that was the extent of her punishment. Despite rumors and accusations, Boss Crump never faced any repercussions for his alleged connections to Georgia Tann. 3 months after her death, the Tennessee Children's Home Society was shut down. The board of directors claimed to be stunned and shocked by Tann's actions. How could they have been her superiors for almost 3 decades without suspecting anything is beyond my comprehension. Yet neither the board members nor anyone else who may have contributed, such as workers or caretakers at the home, were ever punished for their involvement. It is estimated that Georgia Tann's criminal network stole over 5,000 children between 1924 and her death in 1950, and was responsible for the deaths of more than 500. During nearly 3 decades, Georgia Tann reportedly earned more than $1 million from her illegal activities, which is equivalent to over $12 million today. Further evidence of her selfishness and cruelty lies in the fact that despite her public image as an unselfish Good Samaritan, she left nothing in her will to the Tennessee Children's Home Society or to any charity for that matter. Instead, her entire estate went to her immediate family, although the sum was laughable compared to the fortune she had amassed. So, where did all the money go? Well, Georgia Tann seemed determined to indulge a life of luxury, with no regard for the well-being or suffering of others. She had a penchant for expensive fur coats, though her daily attire often consisted of high-end sportswear. Georgia Tann loved to flaunt her social status among Hollywood movie stars. She owned properties, had a chauffeur-driven limousine, and frequently traveled by air, staying in luxury hotels. She also enjoyed taking gambling trips to Cuba. She loved to gamble. Georgia Tann was a truly despicable individual, a perfect embodiment of greed and evil. While thousands of children were being mistreated and thousands of parents suffered from her actions, Georgia Tann was in Hollywood, New York, Cuba, living lavishly and indulging her vices. She personified cruelty and self-indulgence at the expense of countless innocent lives. Before you go, I made a video a while back about a similar operation that took place in the former Yugoslavia. If you found this subject interesting, feel free to check out that video, or explore any of the other stories on my channel. Thank you for watching.